In the dusty streets of Kandahar, Afghanistan, where the sound of gunfire was as common as the call to prayer, nobody expected the smallest soldier in the unit to become their greatest weapon. They told her to stay back, to patch wounds and hand out bandages. They said combat wasn't her job. But when 12 minutes of chaos erupted around her convoy, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos proved that sometimes the person trying to save lives has to take them first. What happened that scorching afternoon in 2019 would challenge everything the military thought they knew about combat medics. It would turn a quiet girl from El Paso, Texas, into a legend whispered about in mess halls across 3 continents. And it would prove that the most dangerous person on any battlefield isn't always the one carrying the biggest gun, sometimes it's the one carrying the biggest heart. This is the true story of how one woman's refusal to follow orders saved an entire platoon and changed the rules of engagement forever. Maria Elena Santos never wanted to be a soldier. Growing up in the sun-baked neighborhoods of El Paso, she dreamed of becoming a nurse, maybe working in pediatrics at the Children's Hospital downtown. Her grandmother, Abuela Rosa, used to tell her that God had given her healing hands, watching as young Maria carefully bandaged the scraped knees of neighborhood kids who came crying to her door. The Santos family had lived paycheck to paycheck for generations. Maria's father worked double shifts at the meatpacking plant, his hands permanently stained with the smell of beef and disappointment. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families on the west side of town, coming home each evening with stories about kitchens bigger than their entire apartment, and children who threw away more food than the Santos family ate in a week. When Maria graduated from Jefferson High School in 2016, college seemed like a distant dream. The nursing program at UT El Paso required 2 years of prerequisites she couldn't afford. That's when Army recruiter Sergeant Williams showed up at the local community center, promising education benefits and a chance to serve her country while learning valuable medical skills. "You can be a combat medic," he told Maria over coffee at a local diner, his uniform crisp despite the Texas heat. "Save lives, get military training, and when you come home you'll have the GI Bill to pay for nursing school." It's a win-win situation. Maria's parents were terrified. Her father had lost his brother in Vietnam, and the thought of his only daughter going to war made him sick to his stomach. But they also understood that this might be her only shot at a better life. After weeks of family meetings that stretched late into the night, filled with tears and desperate prayers to saints both known and forgotten, Maria enlisted. Basic training at Fort Sam Houston was the hardest thing she'd ever done. At 5'2" and barely 120 pounds, Maria looked like a child playing dress-up in Army fatigues. The drill sergeant seemed determined to break her spirit, making her do push-ups until her arms shook and run laps until she vomited in the Texas heat. But Maria had something many of her fellow recruits lacked. She had grown up poor, which meant she knew how to endure. Every morning when her body screamed in protest, she thought about her mother's hands cracked and bleeding from cleaning chemicals. Still getting up at 5 a.m. to make breakfast. Every time a drill sergeant screamed in her face, she remembered her father coming home from 16-hour shifts, never once complaining about his aching back. The medical training phase was where Maria truly excelled. While other soldiers struggled with anatomy and physiology, she absorbed every lesson like a sponge soaking up water. She learned to start IVs on moving targets, to treat sucking chest wounds under fire, to make life-or-death decisions in seconds. Her instructors noticed her natural ability to remain calm under pressure, and her uncanny knack for finding veins that other medics missed. Advanced individual training brought weapons training that Maria initially resisted. She had joined to save lives, not take them. But her instructor, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, pulled her aside one afternoon after she had performed poorly on the shooting range. "Listen, Santos," he said, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "I've been in 4 deployments, and I've seen good medics die because they couldn't defend themselves or their patients. You think healing and killing are opposites, but sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes the only way to save a life is to take one." Rodriguez made her stay after hours, working on her marksmanship until her shoulders ached and her ears rang despite the protective gear. He taught her to see the weapon not as an instrument of death, but as a tool of protection. Slowly, grudgingly, Maria began to improve. Her small frame, which had seemed like a disadvantage, actually made her a more stable shooter. Her steady hands, trained to perform delicate medical procedures, proved equally steady on a trigger. By graduation, Maria had earned the respect of her instructors and fellow soldiers. She wasn't the strongest or the fastest, but she was reliable, competent, and unshakable under pressure. More importantly, she had learned to balance the warrior and the healer within herself, though she prayed she would never have to use both skills simultaneously. Her first deployment came in early 2018, assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division stationed at Forward Operating Base Shank in Afghanistan's Logar province. The base was a small outpost surrounded by mountains and suspicion, where every patrol carried the possibility of contact with Taliban fighters who knew the terrain better than the Americans ever would. Maria's platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson, was a career soldier from Alabama who had been in Afghanistan for 3 tours. He took one look at Maria and immediately relegated her to the aid station, despite her protests that she was trained for field operations. "Look, Santos," Thompson said during her first week, "I'm sure you're a fine medic, but out there things get crazy fast. You stay here, take care of the guys when they come back, and let the real soldiers handle the fighting." For months, Maria chafed under these restrictions. She watched as male medics, half as competent as her, went out on patrols, while she was stuck treating minor injuries and dispensing aspirin for hangovers. She wrote long letters to her grandmother, pouring out her frustration about being seen as too small, too weak, too female for the job she had trained for. The breakthrough came during a particularly fierce firefight in September 2018. A patrol had been ambushed in a nearby village, and 3 soldiers were wounded, including the platoon's primary medic. As helicopters struggled to reach the location due to heavy ground fire, Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Without permission, she grabbed her medical kit and hitched a ride with a supply convoy heading toward the battle. When she arrived at the scene, she found chaos soldiers pinned down by sniper fire, wounded men bleeding out while their buddies tried unsuccessfully to provide first aid with minimal training. Maria didn't hesitate. Under covering fire from the other soldiers, she low-crawled from position to position, treating wounds with an efficiency that amazed the veterans around her. She stabilized a soldier with a sucking chest wound, stopped massive bleeding from a shrapnel injury, and managed to get all 3 wounded men ready for helicopter evacuation. When the shooting stopped and the helicopters had lifted off with the wounded, Staff Sergeant Thompson pulled Maria aside. His face was grim, and she expected to be disciplined for disobeying orders. Instead, he extended his hand for a shake. "I was wrong about you, Santos," he said simply. "You've got bigger balls than half the men in this platoon. From now on, you're our primary field medic." From that day forward, Maria went on every patrol, rode in every convoy, participated in every mission. She earned the respect of soldiers who had initially dismissed her, proving herself again and again in smaller skirmishes and tense situations. She learned to read the terrain like a map, to sense danger before it materialized, to be exactly where she was needed when bullets started flying. But it was her growing reputation for precision shooting that truly set her apart. During quiet moments at the base, she practiced constantly, turning her natural steadiness into legendary accuracy. Other soldiers began seeking her out for tips on marksmanship, amazed that the tiny medic could consistently hit targets at ranges that challenged much larger, more experienced shooters. The irony wasn't lost on Maria. She had joined the army to heal, and she was becoming known as much for her ability to kill as her ability to save lives. In her letters home, she struggled to explain this transformation to her family, particularly to her grandmother, who continued to pray novenas for Maria's soul. "I haven't changed who I am, abuela," she wrote in one particularly long letter. "I've just learned that sometimes protecting life means being willing to take it. Every shot I fire in anger is fired to save someone else. Every life I take is taken so that others might live." As 2018 turned to 2019, Maria had evolved from the scared girl who had enlisted in El Paso into a seasoned combat veteran. She had saved dozens of lives and taken several, each death weighing on her conscience but also strengthening her resolve to protect her fellow soldiers. She had learned to compartmentalize, to function efficiently in the chaos of combat, while maintaining her compassion for the wounded. What she didn't know was that her greatest test was still coming, and it would arrive on a scorching day in May 2019, when a routine convoy mission would turn into the defining moment of her military career. The skills she had learned, the balance she had achieved between warrior and healer, and the reputation she had built would all be put to the ultimate test in 12 minutes that would change everything. The morning of May 15, 2019 started like any other at Forward Operating Base Shank. Maria woke before dawn, as she always did, and spent 20 minutes in prayer and meditation before the chaos of the day began. She had developed this routine during her deployment, finding that starting each day with quiet reflection helped her maintain the mental balance necessary for her dual role as healer and protector. The mission briefing was routine, a convoy run to deliver supplies to a smaller outpost about 40 kilometers southeast of their base. The route was considered relatively safe, having been traveled dozens of times without serious incident. Intelligence reports suggested minimal Taliban activity in the area, and the local population was generally cooperative with coalition forces. Staff Sergeant Thompson gathered the 12-person team in the briefing room, pointing to locations on a map that had become as familiar to them as their own neighborhoods back home. Maria would be riding in the second Humvee with Private First Class Jeremy Collins, a young soldier from Ohio who had arrived in country just 2 months earlier. "This should be a milk run," Thompson said, though every soldier in that room knew that in Afghanistan there was no such thing as a routine mission. "We go out, drop off supplies, maybe grab some intel from the locals, and we're back in time for chow. Santos here with Collins and Martinez in Vehicle 2. Keep an eye on the kid. He's still learning." Collins was eager and nervous, the way all new soldiers were on their first few missions. He peppered Maria with questions during the equipment check, asking about everything from proper radio protocols to what kind of resistance they might encounter. Maria remembered her own early days and tried to reassure him while also making sure he understood the seriousness of their work. "The key is to stay alert but not paranoid," she told him as they loaded their gear. "Trust your training, trust your team, and don't try to be a hero. Heroes get people killed." The convoy rolled out at 0800 hours, 4 armored Humvees carrying soldiers, medical supplies, ammunition, and food for the remote outpost. The morning was already hot, promising another scorching day where temperatures would climb well above 100 degrees. Maria settled into her position, her medical kit secured beside her and her M4 carbine loaded and ready. The first 30 minutes of the journey passed without incident. They traveled through familiar territory, past villages where children waved from doorways and old men watched their passage with expressions that revealed nothing. Maria found herself relaxing slightly, enjoying the routine nature of the mission after weeks of more dangerous operations. The attack came at exactly 0847 hours, at a point in the road that intelligence had marked as completely secure. Later investigation would reveal that Taliban fighters had spent weeks preparing the ambush, moving weapons and personnel into position under cover of darkness, and hiding their preparations so effectively that even satellite surveillance had missed them. The first indication of trouble was an explosion that lifted the lead vehicle 2 feet into the air and sent it crashing back down in a shower of dirt and twisted metal. The IED had been perfectly placed and timed, disabling the Humvee's engine and trapping the soldiers inside. Before anyone could react to the first explosion, automatic weapons fire erupted from 3 sides, trapping the convoy in a carefully planned kill zone. Maria's training kicked in immediately. While bullets shattered the windows around her, she was already reaching for her radio, calling for backup and medical evacuation. She could see that the lead vehicle was badly damaged, with at least 2 soldiers clearly wounded and possibly trapped inside. "Contact left, contact right, contact front." The radio crackled with panicked voices as the convoy tried to coordinate a response to the ambush. Through her shattered window, Maria could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions, indicating a much larger force than intelligence had suggested. The convoy's response was immediate but chaotic. Soldiers poured out of the damaged vehicles, seeking cover behind the disabled Humvees while returning fire at the insurgent positions. But they were caught in the open, in terrain that favored the attackers, and Maria could see immediately that they were in serious trouble. Staff Sergeant Thompson's voice cut through the radio chatter with practiced authority. "Santos, stay back. Get ready to treat casualties as we bring them to you. Do not, I repeat, do not leave your position." But Maria could see things that Thompson couldn't from his position. The soldiers from the lead vehicle were trapped, pinned down by withering fire from insurgents who had positioned themselves with clear fields of fire. 2 men were clearly wounded, and without immediate medical attention, they would die before any helicopter could reach them. Private Collins was beside her, firing his weapon with more enthusiasm than accuracy, his face pale with fear and adrenaline. "What do we do, Sergeant Santos? What do we do?" Maria made a decision that would define the rest of her life, against direct orders, against standard protocol, against everything she had been taught about combat medic responsibilities. She grabbed her medical kit and prepared to leave the relative safety of her position. "Collins, you stay here and provide cover and fire. I'm going to get our people." But Sergeant Thompson said to stay back. "Thompson can court-martial me if we all survive," Maria replied grimly. Right now, those soldiers are going to die if someone doesn't help them. What happened next would be debated in military circles for years afterward. Maria Santos, a 5-foot 2-inch combat medic from El Paso, Texas, single-handedly turned the tide of a carefully planned Taliban ambush through a combination of medical skill, tactical intelligence, and marksmanship, that bordered on the supernatural. Her first move was to provide covering fire for herself, using her superior shooting skills to suppress two insurgent positions that were preventing anyone from reaching the trapped soldiers. With methodical precision, she put down accurate fire at ranges that impressed even the most experienced soldiers in her unit. Under this covering fire, she made her way to the lead vehicle, moving in a low crouch that minimized her exposure while maximizing her speed. The two wounded soldiers were in bad shape, one with a severe head injury from the explosion, another with multiple shrapnel wounds that were bleeding heavily. Working under direct enemy fire, Maria performed field medicine that would have been impressive in a sterile hospital setting, much less in the middle of a firefight. She stabilized the head injury, stopped the bleeding from the shrapnel wounds, and managed to extract both soldiers from the disabled vehicle. But the insurgents had noticed her movement and were concentrating their fire on her position. Maria found herself pinned down with two wounded soldiers and no immediate way to get them to safety. That's when she made the decision that would transform her from a respected combat medic into a legend. Using her intimate knowledge of the terrain and her exceptional marksmanship skills, Maria began systematically eliminating the insurgent positions. One by one, she identified targets and engaged them with precision that amazed her fellow soldiers. Her shots were not random suppressing fire, but carefully aimed shots that found their targets with deadly accuracy. The first insurgent position she neutralized was a machine gun nest that had been pinning down half the convoy. A well-placed shot took out the gunner, and a follow-up shot eliminated his assistant before they could replace him on the weapon. With that position silenced, the convoy soldiers were able to maneuver more effectively. Maria continued her deadly work, moving between treating her wounded soldiers and engaging enemy targets. She seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to know exactly where to look, exactly when to shoot, exactly how to balance her dual responsibilities as medic and warrior. The insurgents, who had expected to overwhelm a surprised and disorganized convoy, found themselves facing coordinated resistance led by a soldier who seemed impossible to kill. Maria's small size, which had once been seen as a disadvantage, now worked in her favor, making her a difficult target, while allowing her to move through terrain that would have exposed larger soldiers. As the firefight continued, Maria's tactical intelligence became as important as her shooting ability. She began directing other soldiers by radio, using her position and vantage point to coordinate the convoy's response. Her calm, professional voice cut through the chaos, providing guidance that turned a potential disaster into an organized defense. Thompson, you have two tangos at your 11 o'clock behind the stone wall. Martinez, there's movement in the building to your right, third window from the left. Her fellow soldiers, who had initially been shocked by her disobedience of direct orders, quickly realized that Maria's actions were saving lives and turning the tide of the battle. They began following her directions without question, trusting her judgment over that of their official chain of command. The turning point came when Maria spotted the insurgent commander, a bearded man in traditional dress who was moving between positions and coordinating the attack. He was well concealed and at an extreme range, but Maria had the skills and the equipment to make the shot. Taking careful aim with her M4, compensating for wind and distance with calculations that had become second nature, Maria squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect, dropping the insurgent leader and immediately causing confusion in the enemy ranks. With their commander down and their carefully planned ambush falling apart under Maria's systematic counterattack, the remaining insurgents began to withdraw. Some fled into the mountains, others disappeared into the civilian population of nearby villages, and a few continued to fight until Maria's precise shooting ended their resistance permanently. By the time the shooting stopped 12 minutes after it had begun, Maria Santos had neutralized 8 insurgent positions, treated 3 wounded soldiers, coordinated the convoy's tactical response, and saved the lives of every member of her unit. The ambush that should have been a Taliban victory had become a complete rout, and it had been turned around by a combat medic who weighed barely over 100 pounds. As helicopters arrived to evacuate the wounded, and reinforcements secured the area, Staff Sergeant Thompson approached Maria with an expression that mixed admiration, bewilderment, and professional concern.
Santos, you disobeyed a direct order. Yes, Sergeant, I did. You left your assigned position and engaged in combat operations outside your designated role.
Thompson stared at her for a long moment, then looked at the wounded soldiers who were alive because of her actions, at the insurgent positions she had silenced, at the convoy that had survived because of her leadership. Next time, he said finally, I'm putting you in charge of the whole damn operation. But Maria knew there might not be a next time. Her actions, while successful, had violated established protocols and chain of command procedures. The military bureaucracy would have to decide whether she was a hero who had saved lives or a rogue soldier who had endangered her unit by disobeying orders. What she didn't know was that her 12 minutes of combat had been recorded by helmet cameras, monitored by drone surveillance, and witnessed by soldiers who would spend the rest of their careers telling the story of the day a tiny medic from Texas saved their lives by refusing to follow orders. The investigation began before the smoke had cleared from the battlefield. Within hours of the convoy's return to Forward Operating Base Shank, Maria found herself sitting across from Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the base commander, trying to explain why she had violated direct orders and standard operating procedures during what had become known as the 12-minute miracle. Morrison was a by-the-book officer who had risen through the ranks by following protocols and maintaining discipline. He looked at the small woman sitting in front of him and struggled to reconcile her appearance with the after-action reports that described her single-handedly turning a potential massacre into a tactical victory. "Sergeant Santos," Morrison began, his voice carefully neutral, "you understand that disobeying orders in a combat zone is a serious offense, regardless of the outcome." Maria sat at attention, her uniform still bearing the dust and bloodstains from the morning's firefight. "Yes, sir, I understand. You also understand that your actions, while apparently successful, set a dangerous precedent? We can't have soldiers deciding for themselves when orders should be followed and when they should be ignored." "With respect, sir," Maria replied, "I didn't ignore orders. I made a tactical decision based on the situation as I assessed it. My primary responsibility is to save lives, and that's what I did." Morrison consulted the preliminary reports spread across his desk. The numbers were undeniable. 0 American casualties, 8 confirmed enemy killed in action, 3 wounded soldiers successfully treated and evacuated, and an entire convoy saved from what intelligence now confirmed had been a sophisticated ambush involving at least 15 Taliban fighters. But the numbers didn't address the larger question of military discipline and chain of command. If word spread that soldiers could disobey orders whenever they felt their judgment was superior to their commanders, the entire structure of military authority could be undermined. The investigation took 3 weeks. During that time, Maria was placed on administrative duty restricted to the base while investigators interviewed every member of the convoy, analyzed helmet camera footage, studied drone surveillance video, and consulted with tactical experts to determine what had really happened during those 12 minutes. Staff Sergeant Thompson testified on Maria's behalf, admitting that his order for her to stay back had been based on outdated assumptions about her capabilities rather than an accurate assessment of the tactical situation. "She saw what I couldn't see," he told investigators. "She made the right call, even if it wasn't the call I would have made." Private Collins, still shaken by his first real combat experience, was even more emphatic. "Sergeant Santos saved all our lives," he said. "Without her, we'd all be dead or captured." "She's a hero, not a criminal." The other convoy members echoed similar sentiments. To a man, they credited Maria's actions with saving their lives and turning certain defeat into decisive victory. They described her tactical leadership, her medical skills under fire, and her supernatural marksmanship with the kind of awe usually reserved for legendary figures from military history. But the most compelling evidence came from the technical analysis. Drone footage showed the precision of Maria's movements, the accuracy of her shooting, and the tactical intelligence of her decisions. Ballistics experts confirmed that she had made shots at ranges and under conditions that challenged even the most experienced snipers. Medical experts who reviewed her field treatment of the wounded soldiers were equally impressed. Under direct enemy fire, she had performed complex medical procedures that stabilized critical patients and undoubtedly saved their lives. Her ability to switch between combat and medical roles without missing a beat was described as unprecedented in modern warfare. The investigation concluded that while Maria had technically violated her orders, her actions had been tactically sound, strategically necessary, and ultimately successful. More importantly, her disobedience had been motivated not by insubordination or personal glory-seeking, but by her professional judgment as a combat medic and her commitment to saving lives. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison called Maria back to his office on a sweltering afternoon in early June. This time his expression was different, less stern, more thoughtful. He had been a soldier for 20 years and he had learned to recognize the difference between troublemakers and genuine heroes. "Sergeant Santos," he began, "after careful consideration of all the facts, I've decided not to pursue disciplinary action against you. Your actions, while technically insubordinate, were justified by the circumstances and the results." Maria felt relief wash over her, but Morrison wasn't finished. "However, I am recommending you for the Silver Star for gallantry in action. Your conduct during the May 15th engagement was extraordinary by any measure. You saved the lives of every member of your convoy and eliminated a significant enemy force while performing your duties as a combat medic under the most challenging conditions. The Silver Star was the third highest military decoration for valor, rarely awarded to enlisted soldiers and almost never to combat medics." Maria was stunned into silence. unable to process the magnitude of what Morrison was telling her. But the real recognition came from her fellow soldiers. Word of the 12-minute miracle spread throughout the base and beyond, carried by soldiers rotating home, by officers writing after-action reports, and by the informal networks that connected military units across the globe. Maria Santos became a legend while she was still serving in Afghanistan. The story grew in the telling, as military stories always do. Some versions had her killing dozens of Taliban fighters single-handedly. Others described impossible shots made at incredible distances. All of them emphasized her refusal to follow orders and her decision to prioritize saving lives over military protocol. The legend followed Maria when she returned to the United States in September 2019. Military medical schools began using her actions as a case study in combat medicine under fire. Tactical training centers incorporated her techniques into their curricula. The tiny medic from El Paso had become a textbook example of how modern warfare required soldiers who could adapt, think independently, and excel in multiple roles simultaneously. But fame came with a price. Maria found herself uncomfortable with the attention, the interviews, the request to speak at military events and civilian gatherings. She had never sought recognition for her actions. She had simply done what she believed was necessary to save lives. The transformation from unknown soldier to military celebrity was difficult for someone who had always preferred to work quietly in the background. The Silver Star ceremony took place at Fort Sam Houston in December 2019, with Maria's entire family in attendance. As General Patricia Williams pinned the medal to Maria's dress uniform, she spoke about the courage required to disobey orders in service of a higher duty. Sergeant Santos reminds us that the greatest acts of heroism often require the greatest acts of moral courage, the general said. She chose to save lives rather than follow orders, and in doing so, she exemplified the highest traditions of military service. Maria's grandmother, Abuela Rosa, wept as she watched her granddaughter receive one of the military's highest honors. The old woman who had prayed for Maria's soul while she learned to kill now understood that her prayers had been answered in ways she had never imagined. Maria had found a way to be both warrior and healer, to take lives in service of saving them. The ceremony marked the end of Maria's active duty service, but not the end of her influence on military doctrine. The Santos protocols became standard operating procedures for combat medics, emphasizing tactical flexibility, independent decision-making, and the integration of medical and combat skills. Training programs were modified to reflect the lessons learned from her actions in Afghanistan. Medical schools across the country began recruiting Maria as a speaker, wanting her to share her experiences with future doctors and nurses. Military academies incorporated her story into their ethics curricula, using her disobedience as an example of how moral courage sometimes required violating regulations. Maria used her GI Bill benefits to attend nursing school at UT El Paso, fulfilling the dream that had led her to enlist in the Army 5 years earlier. But she found that her military experience had changed her perspective on healthcare. She specialized in trauma nursing, drawn to the high-stakes split-second decision-making that reminded her of her combat medic days. During her studies, she began working with veteran support organizations, helping other combat veterans transition to civilian life. She discovered that many soldiers struggled with the same issues she had faced: the difficulty of reconciling their warrior and healer identities, the challenge of finding purpose in civilian life after the intensity of combat, the burden of carrying stories that most people couldn't understand. Her work with veterans led to the establishment of the Santos Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping combat medics and other military medical personnel transition to civilian healthcare careers. The foundation provided scholarships, mentorship, and support services, recognizing that soldiers who had saved lives in combat could continue that mission in civilian hospitals and clinics. The foundation's first major project was establishing a program at Walter Reed Medical Center to help wounded warriors become healthcare providers themselves. The program recognized that people who had experienced trauma were often uniquely qualified to help others through similar experiences. Maria's influence extended beyond the military and healthcare communities. Her story became a case study in business schools used to illustrate principles of leadership under pressure and decision-making in crisis situations. Management consultants used her example to teach executives about the importance of empowering frontline employees to make critical decisions. Women's organizations celebrated her as a role model who had succeeded in a male-dominated field by refusing to accept limitations based on her gender or size.
Young Latinas from communities like the one where Maria had grown up saw in her story proof that their own dreams were achievable regardless of the obstacles they faced.
But perhaps the most significant impact of Maria's story was on military culture itself. The 12-minute miracle became a touchstone for discussions about the evolution of modern warfare, the changing roles of military occupational specialties, and the importance of developing soldiers who could think critically and act independently. Military leaders began to recognize that the rigid adherence to hierarchy and protocol that had served the military well in previous conflicts might be less effective in the complex, rapidly changing battlefields of the 21st century. Maria's success had demonstrated the value of trusting well-trained soldiers to make tactical decisions based on their assessment of immediate circumstances. The changes went beyond doctrine and training. Military equipment manufacturers began designing gear specifically for smaller soldiers, recognizing that physical size was less important than skill and intelligence in modern combat. Medical units were restructured to give combat medics more authority and flexibility in battlefield situations. 5 years after the convoy ambush that made her famous, Maria graduated from nursing school with honors and accepted a position in the trauma center at University Medical Center in El Paso, the same hospital where she had once dreamed of working as a pediatric nurse. But her dreams had evolved, shaped by her experiences as a soldier and the knowledge that sometimes healing required fighting. On quiet nights in the trauma center, when the emergency department was calm, and Maria had a moment to reflect, she thought about that scorching day in Afghanistan, when 12 minutes of chaos had changed her life forever. She thought about the soldiers whose lives she had saved, about the insurgents whose lives she had taken, about the impossible balance between destruction and creation that defined modern warfare. She thought about Staff Sergeant Thompson, who had learned to trust her judgment over his own preconceptions. She thought about Private Collins, who had gone on to become a sergeant himself and credited Maria with teaching him that real courage meant doing what was right rather than what was expected. Most of all, she thought about the lesson that her 12 minutes of disobedience had taught the entire military establishment, that sometimes the most important orders are the ones that are never given, and sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the willingness to disobey. Maria Santos had enlisted in the army to become a healer and had discovered that in the modern world, healing sometimes required the courage to fight. Her legacy lived on in the protocols that bore her name, in the soldiers who trained according to her example, and in the understanding that true heroism often meant choosing the harder path in service of saving lives. The small woman from El Paso, who had once dreamed of bandaging scraped knees, had learned to save lives in ways she had never imagined. And in the process, she had changed not just military doctrine, but the very understanding of what it meant to serve, to heal, and to have the courage to do what was right rather than what was ordered.